The first objection to substance dualism which we will consider is fairly uncommon, but also probably the most serious. This objection asserts that the very notion of an immaterial substance, such as a soul, is just straightforwardly unintelligible or incoherent. As Gary Rosenkrantz and Joshua Hoffman explain, it has been objected that upon closer examination, souls can be shown to be unintelligible. The first objection alleges that Cartesian souls are unintelligible because the nature of such souls cannot be described unless they are described negatively. The second objection is that Cartesian souls are unintelligible because they lack a principle of individuation. Bodies, it is argued, are individuated by their occupying different places at the same time, but Cartesian souls do not occupy places. Now, I actually preemptively anticipated the first part of this objection towards the end of the first video in this series. There, I developed and defended a particular account of what it is for a substance to be immaterial, and I showed that it could be described in positive terms. This, I think, answers the charge that the very idea of an immaterial substance is unintelligible. But for the purposes of this video, we might well add the consideration that it is unclear that the idea of a physical or material substance is actually any better off. For it turns out that it is actually quite difficult to give a comprehensive and uncontroversial account of what it is for something to be physical. As James Madden observes, I do not deny that it is very difficult to articulate what we mean by non-physical substance, and life for the substance dualist would certainly be easier if we could do so. This concession, nevertheless, need not be a deal-breaker for substance dualism. First of all, the fact that we lack an informative definition of non-physical substance is not a strike against the substance dualist, because our concept of physical substance is no better off. What it is for something to be material or physical, whether it is a property or a substance, is a matter of contentious philosophical debate for which no resolution is in sight. Indeed, this seems to be not a matter of mere disagreement, but an apparent case of our just not having a clear-cut sense of what we mean by physical at all. The identity and differentiation of physical objects is one of the perennial problems of philosophy, regarding which there is no consensus view, even among contemporary philosophers. Thus, when asked, what is a physical object, unless we are willing to beg important philosophical questions, it seems that our best answer is, I don't know exactly, but I know one when I see one. But if we are willing to allow promissory notes or appeals to disputed first principles to bolster a notion of physical substance, I see no problem in likewise allowing similar maneuvers for the dualist with respect to the notion of non-physical substance. The substance dualist may admit that she cannot give a clear positive definition of non-physical substance, including criteria for identity and differentiation, but she nevertheless knows one when she sees one. Now, as we have seen, some physicalists have thought that there is a clearer notion of what it is for a substance to be physical than for it to be immaterial because, if nothing else, otherwise identical material objects can be distinguished from one another based upon their different spatial locations. Immaterial objects, on the other hand, are not spatial, and so there is no way to differentiate otherwise identical immaterial objects from one another. 2 points may be raised in response to this concern. In the first place, the dualist can plausibly suggest that while two otherwise identical immaterial souls are not distinguishable from a third-person point of view, or from the outside as it were, the difference is transparently clear from a first-person point of view, or from the inside, as it were. In other words, from the perspective of each particular immaterial soul, the other identical soul can be easily differentiated from itself. As David Lund explains, it may be tempting to suppose that different physical objects are better off than subjects with respect to individuation. for two qualitatively indistinguishable objects can be individuated at a given time by their different places, though two such subjects cannot be individuated at a time in that way. Nor does it become apparent what could ground the individuation of such subjects so long as they are contemplated from an objective third-person viewpoint. This external viewpoint is the one to which we are confined in viewing physical objects and other items that are neither subjects nor states of subjects. But since one has an immediate first-person access to oneself as subject, one may thereby have an access to what ultimately grounds the individuation of subjects, even though that ground is not accessible from the external viewpoint. That we do have a first-person access to what grounds subject individuation seems clear from a first-person viewpoint. When I think about two qualitatively indistinguishable subjects, S1 and S2, from an external third-person viewpoint, no difference appears that would justify the claim that I am thinking about 2 instead of 1. But when I imaginatively suppose that I am, say, S1, the difference seems transparently clear. I am one subject, and S2 is someone else, who, remarkably, has a mental life as similar to my own as it can conceivably be. S2 now appears to me to be just as clearly and absolutely someone else as does some third subject who is not like me at all. As a second point, it's not actually all that clear that identical physical objects are actually any better off than identical immaterial souls when it comes to distinguishing them from one another. The appeal to the physical objects occupying different spatial locations is insufficient to explain the difference because being different physical objects is actually a prerequisite for occupying different spatial locations. Being different objects is, therefore, explanatorily prior to the occupation of different spatial locations. Again, Lund says, what distinguishes two qualitatively indistinguishable objects is supposed to be clear and unproblematic because, not being coextensive, they occupy different places. Their being in different places grounds their distinctness. Having distinct spatial locations is not merely what enables us to know that they are distinct, it is that in virtue of which they are distinct. It makes them distinct. But how can this be? Don't two objects already have to be distinct for them to be in different places? Consider two different places, P1 and P2, leaving aside the question as to what makes them distinct. An object at P1 would be distinct from a qualitatively indistinguishable object at P2, but P1 and P2 clearly do not have occult, causal, or metaphysical powers to make the objects occupying them distinct. What makes two such objects distinct is surely not rendered more intelligible by trying to view their distinctness as grounded in the presupposed distinctness of different places. Even if distinct physical objects are always distinguishable by reference to their distinct places, we need not, and indeed should not, infer that their having distinct places is what provides the metaphysical ground of their distinctness. It seems more plausible to maintain that the distinctness of such objects is not grounded in or reducible to anything else, but is primitive and unanalyzable. Their distinctness is metaphysically fundamental. If Lund is right, and the difference between qualitatively indistinguishable physical objects must be primitive, then the dualist can make the same move with respect to immaterial entities. And it won't help the physicalist to bite the bullet by asserting that different spatial locations really do somehow ground the differences between indistinguishable physical objects, for this simply raises the question of how the different spatial locations are to be distinguished. Again, it seems that such differentiation must be primitive, and if that answer is allowed for spatial locations, then it is allowed for immaterial entities as well. I conclude, then, that the existence of immaterial substances like souls are no less intelligible than the existence of physical substances. So, to conclude this section, I have offered three responses to the claim that the very notion of an immaterial substance is unintelligible. First, I have contended that the concept may be positively defined along the lines presented in my first video in this series. Second, I have argued that the concept of a physical substance is no better off than that of an immaterial substance. And third, I have responded to the supposed problem of individuating indistinguishable immaterial substances by asserting both that the difference is obvious from the first person point of view, and also by arguing that the problem equally afflicts the idea of physical substances.